I'm June Reith.
And I'm Kyle Thompson.
And you're listening to General Intellect Unit. And this time we are reading Internet for the People by Ben Tarnoff, which was released this year, 2022. It's a pretty good book. I liked it. It's a broad history of the development and privatization of the internet, all the way from the basic infrastructure up through the application layers. And it's got a little bit to say about what kind of alternatives might be possible, and what we could maybe do about it. What's your take on this?
Yeah, I think I found the history of the early internet to be quite strong and interesting. Some things in there that I hadn't really run into before, some analysis I hadn't seen before, and that was really cool. The middle chapters on sort of the development of e-commerce and Web 2.0 and Amazon and sort of like the cloud. Those parts I felt were a little bit disconnected from the sort of positive possibilities that were suggested in the first section. And then the conclusion I thought was quite good. I mean, I have some bones to pick with the book and sort of the overall perspective, but there's a lot of like good stuff in there. And as far as a sort of primer to the history of the internet, this is one of the better ones I've read, because I've read quite a few at this point. Yeah.
Yeah. I think I broadly agree. I think in the early parts where he's talking about the pipes and the development of the infrastructure, he has a much clearer bone of contention to pick with. In that, like, there's clear. It's more clear what people power and control over that infrastructure would mean and would look like. Whereas when it comes to Amazon and Uber and stuff like that, it's a bit less clear, because I guess if you succeeded in getting serious proletarian power and ownership over the pipes, then a lot of the, it's like hard to imagine an Uber would even exist, in that kind of form. So it's kind of a little bit harder to connect that, but even some of that history stuff is still quite interesting.
Yeah, there's sort of a point he makes about how, like, we don't want to make like the socialist version of Amazon, the socialist version of Uber, the socialist version of XYZ. Like, we shouldn't limit our imagination to doing the same thing but with a red flag.
Yeah. And so in that case, the application layer would probably just look extremely different anyway. I think that's all fair. There's kind of a nice point that's made early here that, like, he's kind of like laying out that, like, the internet is a thing that has a body, and bodies are historical and therefore political, right? That, like, even this kind of in the preface is kind of like saying that, like, even the undersea cables follow the contours of previous networks, like telephone cabling, which in turn followed the contours of, like, telegraph networks, which in turn followed the contours of, like, colonial conquest and networks of power. And that this is all very much historical and material stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that's a point we saw in, like, platform capitalism that was raised, and it remains a very good point as, like, a counterpoint to the rhetoric of the internet being immaterial, sort of ideal, non-substantial, de-physicalized, disembodied, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah. So the internet and its history is, like, very much tied up in the history of recent developments in capitalism. And, like, early on he kind of lays it out there that, we have this techlash now and all this kind of stuff. The internet has huge problems, but, like, the core problem is privatization and markets and profit and capital. And so the proposal for a solution is deprivatization and decapital, which I like as a, it's a nice clear sort of agenda.
Yeah, I mean, I think that because the book is extremely US centric, it is, I mean, it has a little bit here and there about the UK, but that's just kind of like, the transatlantic Anglo left influence. But it's overall extremely US centric, and so you kind of get a list of things that the profit motive harms that is maybe more extensive than what you would find if you looked at other countries. Because, like, there are a lot of, for example, capitalist countries outside the US that have fairly acceptable access and pricing of internet. It definitely depends on the country, right? Like, you can be the US, you could be Australia, and just have, like, appalling internet quality. And yeah, it's definitely tied to the profit motive. There's no question about it. And this sort of thesis that he develops about the ISPs as slumlords, where they're just trying to charge the maximum rent while putting the minimum investment in, is very cogent. But it really depends on your regulatory regime, and you can have for-profit corporations in, like, say, Japan or South Korea or the UK that can, like, provide pretty decent internet access while still pursuing a profit. It's when you get to things like that are higher up the stack in terms of, say, like Facebook or Google, where the profit motive becomes, like, truly deleterious in a very obvious way, as opposed to just being like, well, I could live with this, that sort of situation. Like, that in the US, you absolutely, like, the internet situation is so bad. Same with Australia. It just is, like, an obvious point of rage, and one that, like, anybody could get behind. Like, something needs to be done to stop this crap. But it's a little bit more nuanced, I think, when you look at other countries where, the state has stepped in to create, to block off some of that, like, extreme slumlord behavior in terms of, or in favor of broader national internet provision at a high quality.
Yeah, because that stuff's good for business, and the voracious vortex of insanity that is the US in the 90s. Yeah, it was only going to go that way.
Yeah, it's sort of in the struggle between the tech giants and the ISPs. Generally speaking, the ISPs have won out. And the tech giants have been forced in the US to simply build their own infrastructure, like, completely separate from the ISPs, because the ISPs are so horrible.
I did love that little bit. Which is its own weird variation on that kind of privatization. It's just like, we're going to build our own sandcastle. Fuck you lot. Yeah. Shall we crack on with Chapter 1, People's History of the Internet?
Yeah, sure.
A People's History of the Internet it's broadly the story of, like, the original development of the Internet as a solution to, well, internetworking via this, like, packet switching strategy where, yeah, it's like, okay, if you want to send messages between machines where you know the destination and you know the source because you are the source, but you don't necessarily know the route there, you need some sort of technology to route messages back and forth dynamically. This would become the internet stack, the TCP/IP stack, and so on. And it takes us through some of the history of development here, but I guess the very high level story is that in the US, a lot of public money was poured into the development of this technology through DARPA and the National Science Foundation and such, to build out an academic, sort of like in academia, build out this network for scientific collaboration.
Yeah, it's you have the stage one is the development of ARPANET at DARPA, which is meant to link sort of command and control facilities to battlefields for the Pentagon. And then you have stage 2, which is where you get NSFNet appended onto ARPANET, which is the universities and science institutions across the country being connected into ARPANET.
Mm-hmm. That whole development is really fascinating, right? That like the it's a kind of given like that. Everyone knows it sort of originates in military technology, but like the contrast between the kind of original envisioned use case where it would be like a mobile network that would remotely link, units on the battlefield, would be dynamically linked to the mainframes in the fucking Pentagon and stuff like that. And how that just wasn't really how it ended up getting used. It was more like email was the killer application for the internet. It was a...
it took maybe a little bit longer for those kinds of applications to be developed. Like, I think maybe it's kind of like around the Gulf War period where you start to see that kind of logistics and information systems being deployed for the Pentagon. Like maybe a little bit after that. It's definitely decades after the beginnings of the internet in sort of the 70s.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But like one of the crucial things here is that like the thing the internet protocol solved was it was a language problem and interoperability problem. The military and ARPA really wanted this universal sort of language or universal communications medium into which you could just plug anything. Plug a Jeep into it, plug a fucking rifle into it, plug an AI in a mainframe that controls nuclear missiles or whatever, and have them all just be able to talk to each other. And that's the really big thing about the internet, is that it is this kind of universal lubricant that allows information to flow pretty damn freely.
I think at some point he calls it like an Esperanto. TCP/IP is like an Esperanto. It's a universal language that has actually been adopted as opposed to Esperanto.
Exactly right.
Which obviously hasn't.
Is it like the I don't know, like two of the most like utopian projects in the world are like TCP/IP and Unicode in terms of universal collaboration?
Yeah. I would say Unicode is sort of it's not quite the same thing as Esperanto, but like just that sort of interoperability I think is very much like Unicode is very much like in the same line as TCP/IP, because TCP/IP wasn't like we created this homogeneous protocol and everybody has to just get on board with it. It was more like an interoperability protocol that could connect up various national internets together.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really important because like you have a lot of heterogeneous technologies out there, especially in the 70s and the 80s, right?
Yeah, because like this book doesn't really cover it, but like obviously this all starts with the US and ARPANET, but there were parallel national networking efforts that were being developed in countries like Japan and France and so on.
Yeah, and like broadly, like because there were these various islands of computing, and like it made a lot of sense to make this kind of universal language that like if you could then later come along and teach your mainframe how to talk TCP/IP, then you're good to go. You can plug into the big universal thing now. This was way before kind of like a much more homogeneous computing environment would emerge later, but this was the days of all kinds of crazy kinds of computers and networks and hardware.
Yes, that's true.
So it kind of really like starts to take off, and again, this is more of the funding stuff like that. Like the U.S. government is pouring in money through the National Science Foundation to make the NSFNet, which would, as you said, was the more academic kind of turn away to get as many people into it as possible for this like research collaboration purpose.
Yeah. So that was big, and it exposed more people to using the internet through universities, and then you started to get sort of like private operations that were piggybacking off of NSFNet in like sort of regions where these NSFNet hubs were.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and there was this initial like kind of like commercial operations were initially forbidden, but like then, as the story goes, like this will get sold off basically and privatized anyway. But there was a lot of pressure, I guess, like as it became more widely available and people got onto it and were like, holy shit, this is actually great. There was like inevitable, like obviously huge commercial pressure to do that. And I think as the author notes, like privatization didn't come. He says like privatization didn't come out of nowhere. It was the plan all along. And so like it was kind of always on the cards for this to get sold off.
Yeah, I think like there were different interests involved, but the sort of the legislators and the government leadership who were administering these internet projects definitely envisioned privatization to a total degree or to a majority degree at sort of the minimum, right? Like there were some sort of outliers who wanted to try to create like a PBS for the internet, sort of like on the cable model or whatever, of like, you have this little zone of non-commercial public use, public access, that exists alongside the majority private internet. But yet, like, that they were definitely not arguing against privatization. They just wanted to circumscribe it a little bit. But they were very much in the minority. And the other thing to note, which I thought was quite interesting, was that this move towards privatization was not just something that was planned in advance. It was also addressing a real problem of bottlenecking in the networks, that like basically the funding that the NSF was getting to run NSFNet was nowhere near enough to meet the demand of more and more people trying to get online. So like there had to be some kind of alternative arrangement arrived at. Like just staying the course was absolutely not an option. And the one that was like extremely heavily favored was privatization, and getting private capital to come in with a lot of government subsidies to build out a more public internet than what had been possible under NSFNet.
Yeah, and like there's kind of a remarkable bit here that like I kind of knew in some way, but it was when it was laid out with this kind of clarity, it kind of all clicked into place for me that like even with NSFNet, like you might think like, oh my god, the government spent all this money on cables and computers and stuff like that, and then just gave the cables and computers to private companies. Wow, that's fucked up. But that's not actually really how it played out. Like NSFNet was riddled with private contractors anyway. Like the NSF was not running the network. It contracted out fucking everything from the beginning. So the actual infrastructure was always in private hands, really, in terms of its operational stuff. And so there's a very short hop.
It was just that it couldn't operate as the internet without coordination resources that were held by the state.
Yeah, that's the crucial thing the state was adding.
Like like they had the pieces of the internet, but they did not have an internet in their ownership.
But once it was all established and was very clearly a thing that was going to be big and needed to scale up, like it's a very short skip then from, like a government funded internet that is privately operated, basically, to after being like a largely government funded internet via huge subsidies that's privately operated. Like it's not that much of a change actually when you think about it. It was a formal kind of opening up and a kind of unleashing of the productive forces or whatever.
The private operators who were running this infrastructure were like very well positioned to become the oligopolists after this transition was over. And almost no one else could buy into that market. So it was like very much set up to be an oligopoly involving the pre-existing telecoms, like the Bell, like the Baby Bells, and whatever other telecom providers existed that were of sufficient size. That was like, it was very much a foregone conclusion once it privatized that it would be an oligopoly.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. There's a little bit here about like the kind of there was some pressure, as you said, for the like public option, like kind of equivalence to public broadcasting. There'd be a little bit like mandated to be siphoned off for public use and so on. And
yeah, like maybe libraries get free access, and maybe there's like some servers that are like, public forums, that kind of thing.
Yeah, kind of the internet equivalent of taking the bus, I guess. There's a little bit here actually that's quite interesting about like Al Gore and his kind of change in stance over the years from like initially advocating for those kind of things and like public-private partnerships, and then ultimately when he's in the White House, it's just all about privatization because it's the 90s, baby. It's what's in the air,
I mean, it feels very typical of the Clinton administration in general, like that. Like, before Clinton actually gets into power, there's like these like little remnants of social democracy in his thinking, or maybe even just corporatism. But like once he's in power, it's just like, nah, like let's just like slash and burn as much money for capital as possible. Like just yeah, let's go like a whole hog. Yeah.
So yeah, there was very little oxygen in the room for those kinds of projects, for that kind of advocacy. Ultimately, it ended up being like extremely privatized, and a lot of the stuff was just handed over with basically no strings attached. It was totally unregulated. Like a really extreme example of this stuff.
Well, what ends up happening is that you get this very funny, I think this is in chapter 2, yeah. You get this very funny distinction in 1996 between, quote, providers of telecommunications services versus the new thing they made, which are, quote, information services. So the former ones are subject to like common carrier regulations. So basically there's certain things that they have to keep open for other businesses to use, right? So you get like these little tiny dial-up ISPs that form all over the country, and I know we had them in Canada as well, where it was like, oh yeah, you could like sign up with a dial-up ISP that could like use the pipes from the big ISPs, and give you a little bit of a better deal, that kind of thing, right? This was possible because dial-up ran over the phone lines and therefore was classified as a, quote, telecommunications service. But they managed to classify like cable internet as an information service, and which therefore had no common carrier provisions. And then they even managed to get high-speed, like broadband internet on phone lines classified as an information service. And there was a little bit of a reversal of this under Obama, but then that was reversed once again under Trump. to just like full on information services, no common carrier. And the reason why you have it sort of get reversed under Obama is not because Obama was a, social democrat or anything like that. It's because Obama was in the pocket of Google and Facebook. Um, and so like this thing, which was initially was sort of like about public access and entry into the market for like small ISPs, really became a battle over like how much rent would the ISPs be able to collect from massive tech firms. Yeah.
Do you remember those heady days of like that yeah, exactly, the Obama era and like net neutrality and this kind of shit, and it was, Google and Facebook or whatever are champions of net neutrality against those evil ISPs and shit like this. And it's like, this book gives us a lovely kind of historical and like material basis for kind of understanding that this is all just a fucking story of privatization that goes up from the ISPs to the Googles and Facebooks, right? Like that there was always a very disingenuous kind of marketing fucking ploy on their part.
Well, because you have like that moment, right, of the internet in the early aughts where things are sort of like maximally tilted in favor of the big tech firms. Like, they have a pretty good deal for internet access. There's they're able to like found this stuff like YouTube that is just like pirating like IP rampantly. Like, piracy is everywhere. The ISPs just have to deal with it, and like Google Books is just like hoovering up like literally every book in existence and putting it on the internet for free. And then you have like a reaction from a lot of like older telecom and media firms, right? Like you have all of the internet file sharing sites being shut down. The reaction against or sort of like the retrenchment of ISPs as like successful rentiers. Basically all kinds of like older rentiers fighting back and getting more power. And then in the Obama period, it's kind of like Obama's in favor of the tech firms, but at this point, they're not like the ISPs aren't really as much on the back foot as they were earlier. The telecoms aren't, these older corporations, and so they get stuff like with Trump, like getting around net neutrality and having like being able to meter access to different things and like providing preferential speeds for, like Facebook. Yeah, you get fast lane access with your phone plan to like these monopolistic corporations' websites, which obviously favors them over anybody who might be new to the market. But, the real sort of like battle between them and the big ISPs is over like, yeah, how good is downstream access going to be for average users so that like YouTube and Facebook and Netflix or whatever could provide 4K video streaming to the consumer. And how much rent are the ISPs going to get out of the big tech firms?
And like, yeah, and that's the kind of the counter strategy then for the tech firms is to like build these shortcuts into each other's networks, and like content delivery networks like CDNs are a big part of that, like pushing data closer to the edge, closer to the actual user, and even like the Netflix kind of strategy of like pushing the actual video content files closer to the edge, like closer to where it's actually streamed from, and like bypassing other parts of the network. There's a sort of weird turf war that goes on over these routes and the traversal of the backbone.
Yeah, and you even have like Google Fiber, like Google trying to do an end run around the ISPs by just doing its own fiber network, and then that really not succeeding. Like they're just too entrenched. They have too much lobbying power, and they can't really make it happen.
And then you get like, you even get just like stuff like Microsoft just laying its own subsea cables and shit like that, you know, just like, we're going to have our own backbone, you know?
Yeah.
Just to get around these things. And that's its own level of the privatization. It's not even that like the infrastructure has become privatized, but then there's just this other infrastructure that gets built straight up as privately owned.
Yeah, purely like privately financed.
This is a Netflix cable.
Yeah. Exactly.
This is the subsea cable that will deliver your Windows updates. You know, it's very single purpose stuff.
And it's happening at the same time that like the big tech firms are like buying up all their potential competitors. So it's like simultaneously they have an infrastructural advantage, and then they're also making sure that they don't have any competition in the market. And it's really just a question of how much rent goes to whom, rather than a question of market competition happening. Because in the US, you have like the extreme case of regulatory capture where the ISPs have like non-competes with each other. Like it's just like, oh, this region of the US is like my private fiefdom, and you don't provide any internet there, and I won't provide any internet in your backyard. So then everybody is just stuck getting the worst possible internet from the one provider in their area, and there's no alternative at all.
Yeah, it's mob, literally just mob behavior. we stick to our own turf.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, it's very much like The Godfather, all the mafia dons meeting with each other to split up New York, but like, except there's no mob war, right? It's just they just keep things very, very under wraps, very like very peaceful. Just keep hoovering up that cash from consumers and governments. Yeah.
And speaking of that we get this lovely section on the internet slumlords where you know, it kind of goes in this thing of like, well, the initial kind of smokescreen justification for this privatization is that like, well, in private hands these companies will build a better internet, which of course is horseshit. Like it's just plunder. And yeah.
Yeah, I know. I'm sure their lobbyists were very convincing about those arguments.
Yeah.
I don't know. Like, I mean, look, it happened with railroads in the UK, right? Like, it makes as little sense in that case as it does for internet
yeah,
in the US.
Totally.
It's just absolute nonsense.
Yeah. And like any listeners in the US will be very familiar with this from firsthand experience, but like, you know, the internet and the access in the US is shockingly expensive and shockingly bad, and it's just an act of plunder. Like whatever revenues go in are just extracted as profit. They're not reinvested into actually improving the service or anything like that. It's just pure slumlord extraction.
Yeah, and like as is mentioned in the book here, like to the extent there is any competition in the US, they are really just competing for the highest income areas. Like they're competing to provide fiber to the richest people. And they make like a lower rate of profit in providing that, but they still make quite a bit of money because these people are so rich, right? Whereas in the rest of the US, if you're not in one of those rich areas, then you're going to get the slumlord treatment, where it is the worst possible service at the lowest possible cost to the provider and the highest possible cost to you, the consumer. Yeah. And like really the only thing you can hope for in terms of internet improving is some kind of public plan happens to come together at the state or municipal level, or your area gets gentrified, but in that case, you're just going to get priced out anyway. So,
Yeah, it's hard to win. And it means that for a lot of, like, for huge numbers of people, it's like internet access is extremely spotty, and often it's like the only route to the internet is through their smartphones, which is its own whole barrel of problems.
yeah, like the smartphone access in the US is like better than in Canada, where it's like truly horrible, because we have like tons of regulatory capture in Canada as well, for like what started out, I guess, as like nationalistic reasons, but I think at this point it's just like there's a cartel of Canadian telecoms, and the sole reason the regulator exists is to protect their market from U.S. telecoms. But yeah, even though it's better in the U.S., it doesn't mean it's like sufficient to make up for how bad the wired internet is at homes.
Yeah. And like I really like this next section on the possibility of democracy, where it's kind of like tied in to the political angle that like yeah, I mean the claim here is that like market dependence makes freedom's material foundations precarious, right? That like
yeah, they talk about like Dewey's sort of arguments about positive freedom, where like you need actual material resources in order to be free, and internet has been for decades one of those resources.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and like it's when you have people that are like parked outside a Starbucks, trying to connect to the Wi-Fi, trying to like fill out a job application or fill out social security application stuff, like that's a material undermining of the foundations of democracy and so on. Yeah, it's a good section,
Yes, yeah. Well, and as Tarnoff mentions, like in the lockdown period, this was especially bad for people who had really bad home internet access, and they were like either siphoning off of some kind of hotspot in like a parking lot, or they were having to use their phones. But as he points out, like a phone is not really an adequate substitute for everything a PC does.
God, no. Yeah, certainly. Especially not for learning and shit like that, yeah.
And I believe it's still the case that, like, in the US, like, depending on your provider, like, phone tethering can be restricted to a laptop or whatever. So that's, like, a massive problem if you want to look at mobile as a substitute for landlines.
Yeah. And the section in the chapter closes out on this kind of nice stuff about like capital as inhuman power that like is force, like it's like the imperative to accumulate that rips up all good things in the world. It's good stuff,
Yeah, like there's sort of the argument that like even for people who are working for these telecoms, for these ISPs, they're not really in charge. He writes, different actors can perform a role sort of like as capitalists differently, but the script remains more or less the same. Accumulation must continue, which means that profit must always be the primary consideration. So it's like, if you deviate from the script, then the shareholders are going to revolt. Like if you're working for a public corporation, and you're out, right? And it makes this point that like the people can't rule with capitalism because in a sense nobody can, which is really the same problem we see in like the energy sector, right? Where everybody just is like passing the buck over the climate crisis, where they're like, well, it's not my problem. I'm just responding to my shareholders, blah, 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 blah. Yeah.
The kind of abdication of agency to this headless accumulation imperative is real bad. It's real bad.
Because, like, I imagine there's even, like, a fair number of people who, like, work for Verizon or whatever who have to deal with the shit internet in America. And there's nothing they can do about it.
Yeah. Absolutely. Chapter 3 I thought was quite interesting. The People's Pipes, which starts out with the historical example of 1935 in Tennessee, with communities not being able to basically get electricity supply and just forming their own electricity supplier. And then that project expanding into the Tennessee Valley Authority, which electrified the region from the bottom up with some financing from above.
Yeah, like you have, he writes, private monopolies dominated the electricity market. This quote unquote power trust was notorious for refusing to serve communities it didn't consider profitable and for price gouging the ones it did. So this is like really where the idea of the power company in Kentucky Route Zero comes from, is this history of the power trusts. And yeah, what FDR did with the TVA and so on was like basically give seed money to power infrastructure co-ops so that they could, kind of using their local know-how and the funds they got from the government, outmaneuver the big power providers like all of Edison's companies and stuff that like had existed from the early times of electrification.
Yeah, and this was a way of disciplining big capital by going around them. Yeah.
Which is obviously like quote unquote like anti-competitive behavior, in the sense that like the state is funding private firms preferentially over the incumbents. But the interesting thing here, I think, is that a lot of these co-ops still exist. They haven't actually like died out, like the small instances of kind of like indie or community internet operations that existed in the early internet period.
Yeah, and the example here that bridges us from the electrification into internetization is quite interesting because, like, the electric power board in Chattanooga, managed to roll out broadband, like fiber optic networks, because it made a smart grid like on top of its electric grid, so it like smartified the electric grid. But then they had to like lay cables to connect all the nodes to that anyway. So it's like, oh shit, we can just do broadband access, and so there was a very natural piggybacking off of the electric infrastructure to provide the internet infrastructure. Yeah, clever.
Yeah, it's pretty cool to see. There are these like small pockets of decent internet provision in America.
Yeah, that's the weird bit, right? Because I mean, there's a good couple of examples here, and it's just kind of reiterating that these kinds of local co-ops are pretty good. But like in some cases, you get like the internet in rural North Dakota is substantially better than the internet you get in Silicon Valley, because like it's a small operation that's like mostly motivated to improve its own service, like, and reinvest rather than extract profits and so on.
Yeah, because they're a co-op and they have like a separate legal charter, and like the fundamental thing is that like building out fiber is expensive, but it's what it costs is so far below the rents that these huge ISPs are charging, that it's fairly easy for a small organization in a rural area to provide a better alternative, because it's like the prices and the access do not reflect the investment costs that the ISPs face. They just aren't investing because they're slumlords. They're trying to get as much out of as they can out of it, as little as possible.
Absolutely, yeah. And we then get a really nice section on the kind of the kind of democratic control and people power that you can get in some of these cases where the cooperatives are like owned, operated, and run by the people that they serve and stuff. And it's some really good stuff here, like examples from Detroit, where like the community is really involved in the maintenance and construction of the infrastructure, and like they have in addition to internet access, they have like an intranet and all kinds of resource sharing going on. It's good shit, you know. It's really good.
Yeah, it kind of reminded me like back in the day, like when I was at University of British Columbia and we had like the Usenet, like the intranet for the university. Everything was on T1, and it was just like a paradise of file sharing and piracy. Uh, but also like kind of a little bit of a community thing. Like you kind of felt like, oh, we're on the intranet. Like it's like, you know, our separate little community here.
It's a cool secret club, you know, that you get to be part of. It's the same thing you get these days with Discord servers. You know, it's a cool secret club that only you're in. You know, and
yeah.
which is a pale facsimile of that feeling from the kind of those other sorts of intranets. Yeah.
Yeah, because I mean, ultimately, it's like you're still within the grammar of what Discord lets you do.
Yeah. You're not going to deploy another application to it or something, or you know, set up a cool file share or whatever. But yeah, I mean, the big point of this kind of section is that, like, when people are active participants, it's all very different from their usual way of experiencing the internet, which is privately. And, you know, we all experience the internet privately and as atomized, just individual users. But, like, these folks in Detroit who are, like, organizing amongst the community and, like, building out infrastructure and maintaining it themselves are experiencing this in a very different way.
Yeah, it seems like they get some kind of like cadre training, like they get like political education in addition to technical education because it's seen as like a political struggle to enrich and protect the community as much as it is a matter of technical upgrades within the city, or just like, you know, getting around all the limitations the ISP place on people.
Yeah. Well, there's a thought for you, like Linux Red Guards or whatever, you know. It's pretty intense. Do you think they have like berets and shit like that they wear when they're going around?
Probably not. I mean, it doesn't sound like they're like trots or something.
No.
Like the sources that they were referring to are a little bit more pink than just like full on like Panthers or like trot sect shit. So yeah, I think it's like, you know, there's political education, but I don't think it's quite in that vein, or at least doesn't sound like it.
No, it doesn't, but it's an amusing thought.
Yeah. Oh no. I mean, I'm sure if like Maoism hadn't died in China, they would have had that, right? Like Red Guard cadres going around installing internet in people's houses.
Exactly, right? Like, and all the if the Stalinites had like fused with the Maoists, and they would like install Gen 2 at fucking gunpoint or whatever. Anyway. Anyway.
Downloading a pre-compiled kernel is counter-revolutionary.
Yeah, and like the fucking proprietary Wi-Fi drivers and shit like that are counter-revolutionary. You can fill in the rest, folks. You know, it's a joke that writes itself, basically.
Yeah.
But yeah, all this serves as really good examples, right? That for real alternatives, right? That like, and it's not an accident that like the ISPs and the tech companies fight back against this stuff really hard and try to like outlaw municipal internet provision and all that kind of stuff.
Oh yeah. The thing that actually I was thinking when I read about those cadres and stuff in Detroit was that it was a little bit more like syndicalism. Was kind of my vibe. Like, it was like, okay, this is like an internet utility that is also a political entity and a governance body, right? So it's sort of like, yeah, it's sort of like anarcho-syndicalist is what it feels like to me. Where you just have this like highly unusual circumstance in Detroit where you have like a body of workers in a particular craft that also are motivated to do political activism and provide services on a non-profit basis, just because it's kind of like a space that has been abandoned by the state and by capital to some degree. And that like sort of has created a little bit of an opening for something that actually looks like anarcho-syndicalism a little bit, instead of just like LARPing anarcho-syndicalism, right?
Yeah, that all tracks. So the chapter then moves on to like I guess like strategies for defending this kind of stuff and for extending it. I guess it kind of boils down to like ensuring that other actors can't just outlaw municipal or like cooperative provision of internet, and then the extension is like trying to call on getting this stuff to be funded, like to get grants and so on. And it kind of ties in with some of the stuff we saw a long time ago in one of the very earliest episodes of the show with like what's it called, like anchor institutions and stuff like that, so that like the state could basically coerce, let's say, universities to purchase their internet services from cooperatives and so on. You know, that like there could be a way of mandating the funding for these kinds of things.
Yeah, just generally sort of similar to that Corbynite white paper on like rural, like extra London investment by the government that we read like quite early in the show's run, of just like how to address this problem of the UK's economy being so massively lopsided towards London, and using those anchor institutions to help do that. Yeah, like this idea of so-called community wealth building, right? It says these relationships wouldn't have to be limited to community networks. In fact, they could buttress an entire ecosystem of new economic organizations. So yeah, that seems to be the sort of area that Tarnoff is imagining. I think it's like I can like see the value of that. What I would not want to see is that you get these like public organizations that are created sort of like the workshops, like the workshops that Tarnoff mentions being created in London when the Trots were in power there. Like in I guess that was during Thatcher's time in power, right? It was like sort of early Thatcher period before she shut them down. But like basically, you know, these workshops like they had in the Commune, or like they had in that period in London, where it's like, yeah, this is super cool, but then as soon as like the state support runs out, they just die instantly. Like they have no capacity to exist outside of state provision. That's like my big concern there.
That's the big problem, right? Like that they're non-viable, right? Like that, like that's in a very Beerian sense, right? That like they're not capable of standing on their own. Like, and it's part of one of the problems I kind of have with some of the kind of strategy or whatever that's laid out here, is that like it's very dependent on the favor of the state and like the winds of favor being happening to blow in your direction for the moment. I don't. But and then yeah, that's kind of the thing, is like some of the examples that are used are examples of like very non-durable forms of power, that like all it takes is a shift in the direction of the wind and the whole thing blows over. And it's
I think the only one that's really like stuck around are these power co-ops that he mentions. Like that's been the only sort of like durable one that I think is in the book. Over like a long period of time. So,
and I guess like I mean, it's sort of like slightly vexing that like even at its best, right? Like say if you had a totally nationalized or whatever socialized kind of internet infrastructure, but like that used to be the case, then it all got sold off by the state anyway, right? Like so it's very kind of like you're back to kind of square one, where like it's all down to whoever happens to be pulling the strings. And the thing is that if it's not the proletariat that's pulling the strings, then somebody else is, and guess who it is? It's capital, you know? And if capital's pulling the strings, then there's really very little reason to believe that these kinds of reforms will be durable. they might be very temporary concessions, and would have to be concessions in response to seriously vigorous, like, civil unrest and, revolutionary threat to the state, basically. But if you're in a position where you're threatening the state like that anyway, then getting internet co-ops is, why not just overthrow the fucking state? I kind of don't know what the strategy would be here, really.
Yeah, there's like a quote that he uses in chapter 4 from Stuart Hall, who is a British social democrat and Marxist. Drawing on the state to make the internet's pipes more democratic requires a different kind of state. One that is rooted in, constantly draws energy from, and is pushed actively by popular forces, in the words of Stuart Hall. Only such a state can help uproot the regime installed by privatization and put something better in its place. So it's I mean, I don't want a state that is constantly drawing energy from popular forces, It's I want a state that, does whatever we can in terms of, pushing a communist and proletarian class agenda against the capitalists, and then as quickly as possible withers away into non-existence, right? It is we don't want to think about the strategy here in terms of being the perpetuation of the state. It needs to be okay, but how does it die off? What is the expiration date on this measure that you are bringing in? Because otherwise it's exactly privatization in the USSR, in Mexico, in the UK, in the US. If these big assets, like you said, are just publicly held by the state, they could very easily be handed over at the top level, because they're usually interdependent on each other, and that interdependence, that power of coordination, is very easily controlled from the top.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely, right. And historically, the state that draws energy from fucking popular forces is that's what consigned socialism to the fucking dustbin of history for so long. Have we learned nothing from the Second and Third Internationals? You know what I mean? It's just, and then it's we were talking about this in the green room, but what you just said kind of brought it back up for me, that it's kind of one of my big problems with kind of social democratic politics is that it's kind of imagined that capitalism is only capitalism at its most vicious, when it's turned up to the maximum, and then if you turn the dial down to be less vicious, then it's a kind of socialism, right? And when the state does something less vicious than maximal capitalism, it's actually doing socialism. And this is the classic trap that so many have fallen into, where it's like kind of making a caricature of ourselves of what the right say about us, that the socialists just love it when the state does things, and that's kind of actually true for many social democrats, whatever. It's just if the state is doing something less horrendous than it could possibly do, then it counts as kind of socialistic somehow. But I think that's a very narrow view of what capitalism is, and I think if you take a more expansive view of I think a historically justified view of bourgeois capital developmentalism, the Tennessee Valley Authority basically is also a kind of an example of this, where the bourgeois state and capital are perfectly capable of using a variety of strategies depending on the conditions at the time, where they're willing to fatten the calf for a while so they can kill it later, And also, the history of the internet fits that paradigm perfectly as well. It's less surprising when you see it as bourgeois developmentalism, and that they fattened the calf for a while and then killed it, or whatever. That's they're able to defer gratification for a little while, and so I'm very cautious about taking too much inspiration from these examples from the previous century, where the state seems to do something vaguely socialisty by just fattening the calf for a little while.
Yeah, it's that classic thing of like developmentalism, like promoting capitalist ends by way of socialistic means. So like, yeah, with the TVA and creating these power co-ops, like the aim is to electrify these areas so as to promote capital accumulation in the areas. It's not to bring socialism to the areas. It was just that this socialistic measure was the most expedient way to get around the obstructionism of the big bourgeoisie.
Yeah. And there's a huge strategic trap that we could fall into where we just decide to kind of do the same thing again, basically, of like, well, let's kind of play that role for a decade or two of like fattening the calf on capital's behalf, you know, and then it's like if you wind, I don't know, like if you set up those conditions again, what's to say that like the next government isn't going to just fucking slaughter you again, right, or sell off whatever you've built? You kind of you need there to not be a state that could do that. There needs to not be a state.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It needs to be like progressing towards its own irrelevance. Is really the framework you need to work into. You need to work in so that it's not all hinging on having a sympathetic state there to advance the aim, like advance popular aims.
Yeah, absolutely. Because once they fatten that calf up, you're gonna get fucking done in afterwards. It's there's a distinct TikTok cadence to these things, and it's all quite. If capital is pulling the strings, and it's not the proletariat that are pulling the strings, really, then and the existence of a state strongly suggests it's still capital, it's still a class society, it's still class dictatorship for capital that's doing it. Then, yeah, I don't know. It all falls out of that, and I guess if we realize that, then that has to feed back into our strategizing. Like, what's the strategy here? And I think like petitioning the state in this Lassallean way to do socialism for a while on our behalf is just kind of not really. I can see why it's appealing because it's a shorter route and it seems more tractable. It seems more tractable than challenging the state, but like I don't think it's actually realistically gonna work.
Yeah, I mean, I think that like, using state resources to invest in setting these networks up is fine and good. If you have access to state power, then fine, go ahead and use it. Like, obviously, the resource distribution between the rich and poor is so extreme that, like, using state power to redistribute some of that wealth is a viable way to like get things going, but like you don't want to create dependence. That's the main point.
And I guess it's worth saying as well, like the book does oscillate on this a little, like where chapter 4 is titled From Below, right? Like, and there is a substantial chunk of the book that's about this, like building power from below and stuff, but it is also there alongside of stuff that seems a lot more statist. And I don't know if it's just for a lack, maybe it needed a bit more editing or a bit more clarity in those regards, but like I don't necessarily get the impression that it's settled one way or the other entirely in the book, because like
exactly, it's definitely not all one way or the other. This isn't like a sort of purely left liberal state industrial policy focused sort of argument.
Absolutely not. Chapter 4 being From Below is kind of about this, like, it's going to need a movement and moving from below, and in order for that to happen, there's going to need to be a lot of conversations and a lot of talking and a lot of convincing people. And the framing for the chapter, I guess, is like, in those conversations, there are three broad concerns that tend to be raised. The concern of, like, if you're gonna democratize and decommodify this stuff, like, there are three concerns that come up. The first one being cost, and the response is like, fuck it, this stuff is already super expensive. Like, we pay a shit ton in subsidies to these fucking companies, so whatever. Second concern being anti-competitiveness, that like, oh, wouldn't that be an anti-competitive move? And the answer is fuck competition. Just like, screw it. Competition sucks.
Well, yeah, and he also makes the quite a good point that like competition in these spaces, not so much in the case of the pipes or like provision of internet access, but in the case of like stuff that's higher up the stack, is like probably going to promote worse outcomes rather than better ones, because people are like, if you broke Facebook up into smaller Facebooks, or like I don't know, like let's say you spun off Instagram and WhatsApp and whatever the fuck else Facebook owns or Meta owns, and then they would be competing in each other, and they would probably behave even worse.
Yeah, they'd be even more
than
vicious
when they're in a monopolistic position, or a oligopolistic position where they can sort of like rely on their fat profits to stave off like investor pressure. So like it's like maybe it's anti-competitive, but like actually more competition could be even worse than what we have in some ways.
Yeah, that is a really good point, right? Like that more competition just gets you into a kind of Red Queen game where everybody's viciously trying to fuck over everyone else, and that could be quite a bit worse for the users. The third concern then is for surveillance, that like wouldn't, I guess like state-owned infrastructure be vulnerable to surveillance, and the argument is basically that it's kind of orthogonal, right? That like we already have substantial like state surveillance through the internet.
Yeah, I mean, it's so extensive. Like, how could it possibly be more? Like with Prism existing, like there's no way it could be more invasive.
Yeah, exactly right. So the two axes of like public-private and privacy versus surveillance don't seem to be related actually. And we've already got a really bad situation.
Yeah, because like it's not to say that the private firms have no interest in protecting user privacy against the state, but it's just like they don't really have much in the way of tools to do so. Like, it's kind of like, I guess it was like for a while, like Apple was trying to build sort of like encryption stuff into their phones and that, and the government was like, we don't like the look of that. And, it's just whenever there's pushback against the NSA or whatever, it's like pretty flimsy. It doesn't really stick.
Well, I kind of wonder that like, Apple and Google or whatever, or all these kind of companies, especially the hardware ones, are kind of like, they pioneer like, full disk encryption and stuff on their phones and like security and stuff to secure their own operations against the NSA. You know what I mean? That like it's more of like a corporate information security sort of measure, and it just happens to be something that's available to the public, more so than
and it can be a selling point too in the market, right? Like I know that like Apple's update policies on their phones and their encryption policies are like a selling point for quite a few people in terms of like security if they're doing like work sensitive stuff on their phones.
Or like BlackBerry, right? Like, and it's a part of its initial takeoff was that executives could use the messaging service, and it was like secure and it was encrypted and stuff, so that they could do insider trading easily.
Yeah, against industrial espionage. Yeah,
they have a certain concern for privacy, but it's not necessarily your privacy as an end user. That's they do want to pioneer this kind of security technology, but like kind of for their own good, more so than anything else. Thank you for listening to General Intellect Unit. While you wait for the next episode, you can find us on Twitter at GIUnitPod. You can find us on the web at generalintellectunit.net, and you can find us on all the podcast apps, so like, rate and subscribe. If you go to patreon.com/generalintellectunit and give us a couple of bucks a month, you can help to support the show and get access to our community Discord. This show is part of the Emancipation Network, a Marxist podcast network and research collective. Go to emancipation.network and check out our sister shows such as From Alpha to Omega, Swampside Chats, Jumpsuit Utopia, and Mortal Science. They're excellent shows and excellent folks. Again, thanks for listening, and we hope you'll join us again next time.